Here's what I want to know. Can the Republican Party survive MAGA? Now, that's a loaded question, so I'll lay out a few assumptions. The first assumption is that the Republican Party is under the complete personal control of only one man, Donald Trump. This is largely a fact. In February, his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, vowed that if installed as the co-chair of the RNC, quote, every single penny will go to the number one and only job of the RNC. That is electing Donald J. Trump as president. In March, she was unanimously approved. A token vote to prohibit Trump from using Republican funds to pay off his legal bills didn't even come close. Secondly, Donald Trump is hollowing out the party. There are very few people left who both think for themselves and have enough conviction to act. Who's left? Who's survived standing up to Trump in the Republican Party? His personal endorsement might be a kiss of death in the general election, but it's all that matters in the Republican primary, and the results aren't surprising. Third, Donald Trump is going to lose. Now, I think he'll lose this election, but even if he doesn't, he will lose eventually because he will die. He will not win forevermore. He will not take over the entirety of America. We will have elections in 4 years. Honestly, it never ceases to amaze me that the idea of a 78-year-old man who lives on cheeseburgers eventually dying is somehow the crazy talk. This is the third assumption. Finally, is this even possible? Don't there have to be two parties? Well, actually, it's happened before. Twice. The Conservative Party has collapsed twice in American history. The first time was shortly after the ratification of the Constitution, and the second was just prior to the Civil War. The first parties were unanticipated and largely unwanted. George Washington very famously disapproved of the parties that were forming in his government and firmly refused to be labeled. They mostly sprung up over the general idea of whether or not the new United States government would kind of actually be a real government, or if it would resemble something like the existing system after the Revolutionary War, in which the states held all the power, the very thing that the Constitution was designed to fix. The Federalists obviously won, mostly because George Washington was a Federalist and his 8 years of president was spent setting up the very government that the Federalists imagined, though of course he would never have admitted that. So over the first 12 years, 8 under Washington and 4 more under John Adams, they implemented something that we would recognize today, at least compared to what the other side, the Democratic Republicans, were hoping for. What followed after the federal government was fully established was a simple collapse in election success. For the next 24 years, the Democratic Republicans would win every election, with the Federalists settling for throwing their weight behind candidates from the opposition that were less worse in their view. After 24 years, the Democratic Republicans effectively split into the liberal wing, called the Democrats, and the conservative wing, eventually being called the Whigs. So you could say they fell apart because they won. They won the single issue they set about to achieve. There was, and always would be, a real government in America. The Whigs collapsed, in some ways, for the exact opposite reason. They refused to address the main issue that their constituents cared about: slavery. The Whigs refused to take a stand on slavery because they did the math and they didn't believe they could win if they lost the Southern Whigs. And in the end, a new party sprung up with the main goal of stopping the spread of slavery. This third party, forever known as the Republicans, split the conservative vote in 1856, but it killed off the Whigs. Now, at first glance, both of these party collapses seem completely different, but here's where they're the same. For the Federalists, they were the Conservative Party when the question was between a real united government or a new kind of government that for many people looked a lot like anarchy. The conservative choice was to set up something normal, a government that did things. But from that moment on, the battle was won. Were they still conservative? And the Whigs, on the other hand, refused to take a stand on the one major issue that was already causing civil war in parts of the country: the spread of slavery across the ever-expanding country. So back to my original question. Can the Republican Party survive MAGA? What happens after Trump? There will certainly be a conservative party. In fact, there must be. But what's left of the Republican Party that still espouses conservative values? Conservative with a lowercase c. And for that matter, what does post-Trump conservatism even look like? These are the questions that will shape the next few decades of American politics, but they don't necessarily answer the question, what happens to the Republican Party? So let's take a look at 3 possible scenarios and ask what conditions might drive each outcome. The first is that the Republican Party survives MAGA and remains the conservative party in American politics. This is the default. So if we imagine how this comes about, It's because the next two options don't happen. What we're essentially saying is that if nothing kills it, it lives on. For that reason, we'll ignore it and instead focus on what might cause the party's demise. Working backwards through time, we see the death of the Whigs, and the murder weapon is a third party. Why did it happen, and could it happen now? Well, it happened in 1854 because abolitionists lost faith that their party, the Whigs, would ever stand up to slave interests, and because they could not achieve their political ambitions by aligning with the Democrats. They were forced to choose. So the question is this: are conservative voters, who are being repelled from MAGA, and hence from the Republican Party, unable to find satisfaction in the Democratic Party and in sufficient numbers? Numbers large enough to push a third party into what we'll call independent relevance? Not just relevance because they can be spoilers, but relevant in their own right? Now, your answer to those questions might be different than mine, but I don't see this happening, at least not right now. In fact, the reason I don't see this happening is because the Democrats are in the process of pulling off one of the greatest moves to the center we've seen in generations. Seriously, where are the nut jobs in the Democratic Party? Where are the climate doomers? What happened to nationalizing higher education, defunding police, and dismantling the military? What happened to redistribution and universal basic income? Republican strategists and politicians might hate it, but this move to the center means that there's no single issue like slavery that seems to be forcing disenfranchised conservatives to consider a new party. Which leaves us with the slow death. Election after election of losses, until the only way to enact conservative policies is through the conservative wing of the dominant party, at which time it splits. From the time that Thomas Jefferson was elected in 1800 and the Federalists collapsed, there were 24 years of continuous single-party rule before John Quincy Adams ended it. Except he didn't, because he was in the same party. Since Donald Trump was elected in 2016, there have been 6 years of losses for the Republicans, and that's me being harsh. On the other hand, imagine that you're a rising conservative politician in a moderate state. Which party do you join? Well, if loyalty to Trump above all else doesn't bother you, it's an easy choice, and you need only praise Trump louder than the next sycophant looking for his endorsement. If your loyalties are to principles, in this case American conservatism, your choice might be equally clear, or at least it's becoming more so. Not only is the Democratic Party shifting to the center, where your voice might just be welcome, you'll also be competing more and more against candidates that lack principled ideology. In addition, being in the conservative wing of the Democratic Party gives you just as much support as any other Democrat, whereas your competitor might hope for party funding and support, but since the Republican Party is the party of only one man, they certainly cannot count on it, which means it's a race of endurance, a race to see if the Republican Party can live long enough to survive MAGA. With perfect hindsight, we can see that the Federalists were doomed. From 1800s onwards, they would never again control any branch of the elected federal government, but they didn't know it at the time. In fact, it wasn't until 1820 that the Federalists finally gave up trying to field a presidential candidate, when they let the Democratic-Republican James Monroe run unopposed for re-election. The very next election, there were 4 candidates for president, all Democratic Republicans, and the winner was a former Federalist, John Quincy Adams. The party had split, but it took a long, long time. Donald Trump's control over the Republican Party will likely last through 2028, because if he wins in November, he'll be the president, and if he loses, he will need his status as the leader in opposition to keep himself out of jail. Either way, it will have been 12 years of Trump's rule in the GOP. It took 20 years for the Federalists to realize they were doomed.